In this lesson, we're going to talk about utilitarianism. This is one of the main ethical theories that's still discussed to this day and embodies one of the main ways of reasoning about ethics. You can look at the historical background on this and see that the theory is very closely associated with two well-known philosophers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both of whom, especially Mill, made significant contributions to other areas of philosophy as well. And they were trying to put ethical reasoning and reasoning about public policy and about individual actions on a rational basis and a more scientific way of thinking about ethics is how they conceived of it, so that we could make decisions that we could all agree on, no matter what our religious background or other sorts of beliefs were, because the decision we were making depended on whether or not the action or the policy was going to create the greatest amount of happiness for those affected by the action or policy. So here's a simple scenario. It's a little silly, I guess, but it's simple enough that we can understand it. And then talking about this will help us get an idea about utilitarianism and how it contrasts with other sorts of theories. So Mary pokes John with a stick. So we have someone who does something, and in this case they do it to another person, and presumably there's some outcome, that something happens after this, although that's not part of the scenario here. All we get is this simple statement of what happened. But when we think about ethical theory, okay, and we want to evaluate a scenario like that, we can think in terms of the motive, which is, why did the person do this thing? Why did Mary poke John with a stick? Is that important to us when we assess the value of this action? And the motive, of course, led to the act, her poking John with the stick. And as I said before, even though it's not discussed in the scenario, there are presumably some consequences to this, and we don't know what they are, given that we just have a very bare bones type of scenario, but we can presume that something happened. He cried out in pain, he was hurt, he was injured, depending on where he was poked. Again, we don't know the motive. It's not part of the story either. We don't know why Mary did it. So if we were observing this happen, all we would see was that she did it, and maybe wouldn't know why she did it, but we would know what she did. She poked him with a stick. So the utilitarian view focuses on the consequences of the action. It says that's what's important to determining whether or not the action was right or wrong. Now, we may, think, well, he was grievously injured by this, so this would make the act much worse than if he was, not harmed at all. So we say, well, there are potential consequences to any act, but what matters are the actual consequences. And so the act itself is not crucially important, and neither is the motive. What matters is the consequences. And utilitarianism, for that reason, is called a consequentialist ethical theory. And theory we looked at previously, ethical egoism, is also a consequentialist ethical theory, but looks at the consequences only for the person who's performing the action. It's based in self-interest, whereas utilitarianism is based in the interests of everyone. And so what matters is the consequences for everyone affected by the action. So we may think in the scenario we laid out that not just the consequences for John, maybe there are consequences for his family. If he's very injured, maybe there's consequences for the healthcare system. Maybe there's consequences because law enforcement has to get involved if it's considered to be a criminal act. His family has been harmed in some way. So you can see a lot of people could be affected by this very simple action. But again, maybe hardly anyone's affected, again, depending on the severity of it. Of course, you can find this on these pages. One way that the utilitarianism is expressed is in terms of the principle of utility. And utility is just the word where obviously the name of the theory comes from, and it says the idea of the total amount of happiness, where happiness is conceived of the total amount of pleasure minus the total amount of pain. And by the total, we mean the pain and pleasure for everyone who's affected by the action. So right actions promote happiness. It's put in other ways. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. It's a way that Mill put it in one of his writings. So that's the basic idea behind utilitarianism, is that what matters? Consequences. What consequences? The happiness of everyone affected by the action. Or policy, we're focusing only on an action right now. So how do we calculate happiness? Well, we take the pleasure, which we could call a benefit, minus the pain, which is a cost, equals the total happiness or utility. So this is what we call a utilitarian calculus, right? Where we take the total amount of pleasure minus the pain and then look at what the total is, and we compare one action to another. We can compare Mary poking John with the stick to her not poking him with the stick and see, we'll try to calculate which one would have the most total utility or total happiness. So I could say that one act, Mary pokes John with a stick, or Mary refrains from poking John with a stick. And again, focus on the consequences. Again, he could be very injured, he could be not. Maybe there are consequences for her. Maybe she takes some kind of pleasure from doing it. She thinks it's funny. Maybe she's really angry with John and wants to get revenge on him for something. We don't know, again, because the motive wasn't part of the scenario. But we can think about like the pleasure she would take from doing it. And then would that balance out the pain that John feels from this happening? So again, any scenario has to be much more developed than this for us to actually do a utilitarian calculus. Although we may think in general that poking people with sticks is not a good idea. Now, a little bit later in the chapter, we talk about evaluating the theory, and I'm not going to rehearse the objections to the theory because primarily at this point we want to focus on just understanding how to apply it. How do we apply it to more complicated scenarios, more complicated public policy issues even than the slight one that we just looked at. But again, you can look at the text on these pages and see that there's several famous objections to these. Just to mention one is the scenario where, well, would it be morally permissible to execute an innocent person if doing so would stop, say, people from rioting? And maybe on a utilitarian view, people might say, yes, it'd be okay to sacrifice this one person in order to save many others. And there are various other versions of this same kind of scenario. And when we look at the theory and in our writing and talking about it in the discussions, we can see how some of these tensions come out. But be that as it may, even though there may be problems with the theory, there's problems with every ethical theory. But we can think of any ethical theory as capturing something important about the way we reason about ethics. Yes, consequences do matter. Yes, people's happiness does matter. This is a very important value, and it's something we keep in mind when we make ethical decisions. We don't completely discount how what we do is going to affect everyone. And certainly when we're making big policy decisions for our country and for our state, etc. Now that takes us to the act and rule version of utilitarianism, which I've been alluding to throughout this mini lecture, which is that we can evaluate individual actions like Mary pokes John with a stick, or we can evaluate a rule, such as the rule would be something like, generally speaking, don't poke people with sticks. Might be a rule. We say, well, we should follow this rule and we should enact it maybe as a law. Maybe we make it even more general than that and make it a rule against assault. Right? We say, well, that's a good rule to have because having it tends to promote happiness. Are there some cases where it won't promote happiness? Yes, but we'd say that overall, in general, this rule, having this rule and making it a law, would tend to promote happiness. And that's how the rule version works. You say, well, yeah, there may be exceptions to it, but since we've decided on this rule and we think it will promote happiness in the long run, then we should do this. And a lot of discussions of public policy, say in Congress of the United States, for example, when they're deciding which laws to enact, a lot of the debates and the data brought to bear is whether or not this is going to make more people better off or make people worse off, and then who it's going to make better off and who it's going to make worse off. And so people do focus a lot on the consequences. We focus on other things too, like civil liberties and stuff, but we tend to do a lot of focusing on the consequences in terms of happiness, in terms of things related to happiness like money and health and well-being. So this concludes our discussion of this quite important ethical theory, and one that I hope it'll be interesting to discuss and apply in the coming week.